Don't be distracted, chat. Do not get distracted, my friends. Alrighty. Let's get started. How's everybody doing today? We are gonna start the stream. We will begin. Concerta gang? It's one of the options for sure. Alrighty. It's 2 a.m. here. Wow, where are you exactly? Where's that's like Singapore or something? East Asia, like Taipei? Yeah. Philippine gang. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because guanfacine and Philippine actually rhyme, but one is a drug and one is a country. Hope y'all are doing well today. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Boston. Just a reminder that everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be for educational purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. So if y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. So what are we doing today? So just a couple of announcements. So first of all, we're back to regular stream schedule. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We're going to do a lecture today on ADHD. We're going to review a couple of subreddit posts. We will maybe do a lecture on Wednesday and answer questions. And then on Friday, we're going to have a interview with Masayoshi. So looking forward to that. So we're going to do, try to deal with, because we're getting a lot more questions now. So we're going to try to deal with a couple of those. I think there are some topics that people find very, very interesting. So we're going to try to lecture on those. So hopefully it'll be helpful to y'all. And we're going to try to balance between stuff that everyone can relate to and stuff that some people can relate to. Yeah, so other things is, in general, we've got, I think, 1 or 2 ADHD lectures left planned. So we're kind of curious if y'all want us to do something in particular over December. So what do y'all want to do in December, chat? What are we doing, yo? Y'all want to do more questions, interviews, meditation stuff, more forbidden jutsus, playing games. That's totally fine. Deep lectures on topics. Christmas stream. Can we poll? Poll? Mods. Mods. Do y'all wanna deep lectures? We're gonna do deep lectures, chat. Education about drugs, okay. Mental health advice for getting through the holidays alone, okay. We can do more stuff about holidays. Play Dota, always down, chat. Ooh, I think we did something on frustration tolerance and ADHD, right? Okay. Dealing with narcissistic parents. Okay. Holiday emotions. Okay, purpose. Inferiority complex. How to get off of opioids. So if you're addicted to opioids, I highly recommend you actually see like a medical professional. Like, it's rough. High functioning autism. Okay. Why tired? Have y'all seen the video about the lab tests that y'all should get if y'all are tired? Epilepsy and Keppra, dude, that's also like medical advice level stuff. If you've got epilepsy, you might need to be on Keppra. What else is there to say? Okay, it looks like most people want deep lectures. Okay. So what deep lectures? Okay, let me think about that. Okay. Okay. Deep lectures it is. How to stop procrastinating. Have you all seen the 3 kinds of procrastination? Dr. K's Guide to Dota is coming. We're making something about Dota. It is my secret jutsu. Psychology and social. Okay, lecture on anxiety. Okay, so for people who are saying lectures on anxiety, you guys do realize we have an entire like guide to anxiety, right? Y'all are aware of this? So the most popular topics, let's just talk about this for a second. The most popular topics we like synthesized like over the course of 2 years. We saw, oh, hey, like people keep on asking us the same questions about like meditation. They keep on asking us the same questions about anxiety, on depression. And we like, so the meditation guide, for example, has like people will ask like, oh, what kind of meditation should I do? Like there's a guide for that. Like we talk through all the different traditions of meditation, the different styles of meditation, different kinds of meditation. And then like we recommend different techniques depending on what you're interested in. There's like different like paths. So like in the meditation guide, for example, there's the path of knowledge, which sort of teaches you about the nature of knowledge, learning, and how to study. There's the path of the self, which teaches you about like the nature of self and how you sort of like find confidence and like what's ego, what's confidence. There's the path of accomplishment, which is all about like sort of motivation and success and like where success comes from. You guys were not aware of this. We have this all, and y'all can get it. So it's that's the guide to meditation. So I guess you can exclamation point guide. There's one on anxiety too. So in the anxiety guide, we talk about, so this is the thing. If you all are interested in this stuff, or people that you know are interested in this stuff, you can actually, we like created this gift functionality because everyone was like, hey, I want to send the guide to people that I know because I think they would benefit from it. So we have all of that. That's part of the reason we're doing stuff on ADHD is because there's no guide to ADHD. So we're like doing one lecture kind of at a time. We may put together a guide on ADHD at some point, but if y'all are interested in like in-depth, like, so the meditation module, for example, has like 20 meditations in it that are sort of guided and specific to things that you may want. Okay, there are emotes being delivered. I don't know exactly what that means, but so check it out. So the other thing is that, there's going to be like the other thing we have in the meditation guide that's very hard to do on stream or on YouTube or whatever is there are advanced techniques. So we'll sometimes teach advanced techniques like we did on Saturday, and like half of the people miss it. But in the meditation guide, you learn like phase 1 of the technique, phase 2 of the technique, phase 3 of the technique. And so if you like phase 1, then there's like an advanced meditation, a more advanced meditation. So that kind of stuff. So if you guys are interested in that stuff, like also basics of Vedic psychology and things like that, you should definitely check out the guide. If you have friends who are interested, send it to them. Okay? Sound good? Chatars? How to use flying yeah. We did our meditation, levitation meditation the other day. How exactly can meditation be dangerous? It can induce psychosis. Okay, Dr. K, now how do I become a Buddha? You can't become a Buddha. You're already a Buddha. That's why it's so hard. That's why you're failing at becoming one. How can you become that which you are? You can't. Easy. Next. Why can't you meditate? So two answers to that. So the first is, have you tried? And the second is, you haven't had a good teacher. Those are the two answers to why can't you meditate. So for people asking what are the other meditation techniques, there's like 30 meditation techniques. So I can't go through them all. They're also indexed now. So if you guys like a particular, like you can search based on like tradition, goal, whether it's a grounding technique, open awareness technique, etc. Whether it's a breath, body, sound, whatever. Sound good? Someone's asking, how do I stop being a Buddha? You stop being a Buddha the same way that a rock stops being a rock. See, we become Buddhas, so you may ask yourself, how does a rock stop becoming a rock? So let's think about that. A rock stops becoming a rock when it becomes part of, like, let's say, a structure, right? So when I look at a stone castle, do I see rocks? No, I see a castle. So the thing stops becoming the thing when it starts to become something greater. And so how do we stop becoming Buddhas? We start identifying with things that are greater. So we start identifying with being a human. We start identifying with being a male, being successful, unsuccessful. We add attributes that are emergent properties or abstractions on top of the substance of the thing. So a rock stops being a rock when it becomes a castle, but a castle is not a real thing. It's an abstraction. So we stop becoming Buddhas when we start laying abstractions on top of ourselves, like doctor or student. Those are not real things. They're abstractions. And the more we identify with those, the less we identify with our true self, which is the Buddha. You guys get that? So it's like, sometimes people ask these questions and they're like, how do I stop being a Buddha? It's like, you stop being a Buddha when a rock stops becoming a rock. And then everyone's like, oh, wow, like that's like a deep Zen kind of thing. Let me meditate on that. It's not that deep. It's like pretty simple. Happens to be true, but it's also like pretty simple. Right? Is love conditional? Ooh, that's tough. Love is an emotion, but does it have to be unconditional? I don't know, man. I think unconditional love can lead to a lot of bad things. Honestly, chat, what I feel like doing more than anything else today is just like playing video games and vegging out. Any recommendations on where to find meditations from? Yeah, so we have a meditation playlist. No, we can't do that. Okay, let's talk about this. I'd love to Dota stream, but we're not going to do that. We're gonna do our lecture because like that may help some humans, right? So sometimes in life we don't want to play video. We want to play video games, but we have like a higher calling of like doing our work. So maybe today will be one of the days that we play video games. May take a break after we do what we're supposed to do. And so, like, I know I want to play Dota. Y'all want to play Dota. I get it. But we're not going to do that, right? So that's, like, important. So, yes, we're going to not say screw it and just play video games. We're going to have a good time, and we're going to do some teaching, and we'll see how that goes. Does that sound good? I hope to play in the evening. I don't know if I'm going to have time today. I got a lot of work to do. Oh my God. No. May actually be hard to do anything except for play Dota now. Because lecture involves the water went down the wrong pipe, chat. I rolled a 1 on my drinking water check. Right? Wouldn't that be a funny excuse? So, chat, we're going to talk about spirituality for a second. Sometimes we're tested by life. When we have a desire like playing video games and we have a duty like lecturing, what life will do to test us and test our resolve is to create some kind of random event that makes it hard for you to follow through and gives you a reason to quit. So you got to watch out about that stuff, chat. So the more successful you become, the more life tests you. So be careful. The universe is telling me to play Dota. But we will not do that. Why don't you fix your self-esteem? What's wrong with my self-esteem? Is there a problem with my self-esteem? Universe is choking you. Yes. Universe played its choking attack. All right. Let's do lecture. Okay. So let's talk. Oh my God. This is going to be tough. On how to drink. Yes, this is the biggest lecture ever. Okay. Dr. K's guide. So it's actually really terrifying, but there are some nervous disorders in which you lose your ability to swallow. It's really sad. Like, I've seen that with people who have throat cancer. It's interesting, like, what we take for granted until we lose it. Like, so I had a patient with throat cancer who, like, couldn't swallow. So what happens is the throat cancer, like, messes with all the nerves that follow, that do the swallowing reflex. And I don't know if y'all really understand this or not, but we have this, like, we have the trachea and the esophagus. And so we've got, like, these two tubes that kind of run down our throat. And one of them goes into our lungs and one of them goes into our stomach. And so we have, like, this flap that closes off the esophagus when you breathe so that air goes down the trachea. And sometimes you'll have, like, the function of the flap then opens when you swallow. So when you open, it blocks off your trachea and it starts to, I hope that my anatomy is correct there. You got to remember I'm a psychiatrist. And then it, like, opens a flap that sort of blocks off the trachea and then food goes down the esophagus. And so if you have throat cancer, sometimes those nerves can get messed up and you can't swallow, and it's actually, like, really, really sad. Because this person, like, kept wanting to eat, right? Because it's like you want to eat. And so they were getting, like, parenteral nutrition. So they were getting, nutrition through IVs or directly tube feeds into their stomach. So they were, like, they could still get sustenance, but they couldn't, like, taste food. So then they would do stuff like, so they tried to eat and they thought they could get it. It didn't always mess up. But then what would happen is if your epiglottis doesn't work properly and you kind of aspirate, You get food in your lungs, and then that causes inflammation and infections and all that good stuff, or bad stuff. And so this poor dude even got to the point of like, he would like put food in the mouth and then like chew it for a while and then like spit it out, which was like the most unsatisfying thing you can ever think of. So what's the context? There is no context. We're doing a lecture on ADHD and Dr. K is getting distracted. It's really sad, man. So like, don't take your health for granted, chat. Like, the ability to swallow is not to be underappreciated. Did he get help? I mean, sure, he sort of got help. I mean, he was in the hospital for a while and then he had late stage cancer, so he passed away. But, that's what cancer does. Sometimes illnesses kill people, including mental illnesses. We don't tend to think about mental illness as a terminal disease. We don't even think about ADHD as a terminal disease, but sometimes it absolutely can be. We think about, if you guys saw the ADHD and depression lecture, ADHD is so tightly tied to severe depression, leads to worsening suicide attempts, more severity of suicide. We don't think about these things as terminal illnesses, but they are. They can be, at least. But they don't necessarily have to be. Okay. So let's talk about ADHD. Oh my goodness. Let's see if this works. This work? Chat? All right. So let's talk a little bit about what? What about? I see this person posted something about thought cancer, but I assume that's throat cancer. Okay, let's start with ADHD. Okay, hold on. All right. So, there's been a lot of interest in our community about ADHD recently. And, we've been talking, we did a lecture on why people with ADHD wind up with addiction so easily. We also talked about why people with ADHD wind up with depression so easily and like what are the correlations between those two things. But one of the key things that I tend to talk to just about all of my ADHD patients about, which we haven't really talked about here, is why ADHD exists. So if you guys check out Dr. K's Guide to Depression and Dr. K's Guide to Anxiety, there's sections in there about why depression and anxiety exist. Like, these are essentially illnesses that are hyperactivations of existing circuitry. So in the case of depression, we have this thing called the default mode network, which gives us the capacity to self-reflect. And it's when our self-reflection capacity gets overblown and turned on, stuck in the on position, that we wind up with depression. So people who are depressed, for example, always think about themselves, like in a weird way, right? They're like, oh, the world would be better off without me, where it's like the world doesn't really, it's like going to be okay if you're there or not there, right? You start to think like very, very, you get stuck thinking about how bad you are, like literally the thoughts in your mind are stuck on you and your sadness. And anxiety, for example, anxiety is nothing but the ability to predict danger in the future. Like, that's a very useful circuit to have in the brain, right? Like, we want the ability to predict problems. When that circuit gets stuck in the on position, we end up sort of like always seeing danger everywhere because any uncertainty becomes a source of danger. And so this is the kind of thing where, like, as we understand depression and anxiety, and if you really want to overcome them, you have to understand like why these things exist in our brains and where they come from to truly like understand how they work and then ultimately master them. So what I'd like to do today, we've talked a lot about ADHD and depression, ADHD and addiction, this and that, yada, 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 procrastination, whatever. But we've never talked about why ADHD exists or what is it truly. And so my hope today is to share with you all some information about my understanding of like why humans have ADHD, how ADHD is changing over time and how it may not necessarily be as maladaptive as people think. So the first thing to understand before we kind of dive in is that I'm going to be talking about ADHD in sort of a broad term. And I just want to acknowledge that, for example, like if we look at the level of ADHD across the population, that it kind of varies, okay? And what I mean by that is that there's sort of like a bell curve of attention. So let's do this, okay? So if we want to understand ADHD, what we want to do is we just have to start by kind of acknowledging this. So if we look at like people's attention, so the capacity to attend to something, society looks like this. So there's like, you know, most people like can sort of control their attention. This is where like most people kind of exist, right? So one standard deviation includes 85% of the population, if my statistics is pretty good. But then there are some people over here who have very strong attention. And then some people down here who have attention that wanders a lot. So what we're going to talk about is why human beings have fluctuating or like a wide span of attention, right? So if we look at human beings, if we look at something like, let's say we just look at height as a quality or tendency to get angry. So like we look at anger or height, we see essentially the same thing. So most attributes within human populations are going to follow this kind of bell curve, where like 85% of people are going to be here, and then some people get super angry, and then some people are doormats. And that's just how human beings work. So the question is sort of like why, and it tends to be that, you know, human beings have variability in situations that like variability is beneficial for people. So if we look at something like anger, you know, we don't want everyone to be getting super pissed all the time. We want some people to be like, get angry easily, right? And maybe they're going to be our warriors. And then we want some people who are going to be like a little bit more passive, and maybe they're going to be our farmers. And so we tend to see across human populations that we have, you know, a bell curve of cognitive ability. And attention is no different. So then the question becomes like, why wouldn't we want everyone having like a super focused attention? You know, why do we want people that have attention that wanders? And so the short answer is like, there's a very interesting theory about hunters versus farmers. So some people did some personality research and essentially concluded that there are two types of people. The farmer is someone who like likes routine, doesn't get bored. So like, you know, wants stability. So the farmer will like wake up at 5 a.m. every day, like go out to the fields, do the same thing like day after day after day after day. And they derive a lot of pleasure or enjoyment from like things like routine and stability. They dislike being disrupted. So they don't want like random events to happen. They want to be able to predict things, and they derive a lot of like pleasure, enjoyment, and satisfaction out of routine. And then we have hunters. So hunters are a little bit different. The idea of waking up and doing the same thing over and over and over again is like very, very like annoying or frustrating to them. They get bored easily. So what they need to do is they need to be like more dynamic. So they like, you know, walking through the jungle and paying attention to lots of different stimuli. So they're like, oh, like, look, there's like something happening over here, and then this looks like a animal footprint, and what is that I smell? It seems like something's going on. I smell something strange, and then there's birds circling overhead. Oh, they're like vultures over there, so maybe there's like some kind of predator over there. So hunters are people that integrate a lot of information. And so what we kind of see is that in like old human society, we sort of needed both, right? We needed some people to go out and hunt, and we needed some people to like kind of stay at home and farm. And that the more successful societies were the ones that had like both cognitive types, okay? So in a sense, like what we see is that attention variation within populations is selected for, is a positive. So what does that mean for us, okay? What that means for us is that our society has been shaped over the last year primarily by farmers, right? So like if you kind of look ever since the Industrial Revolution, like we've had, this idea of like fixed time jobs, right? Like as things got more centralized, what we started to see is like, okay, you go to the same place every day, you have your job. Like even the concept of a job, like a thing that you do instead of lots of things that you do, is like a farmer-oriented society, right? Because the farmers basically took over, and they're like, everyone's going to have a job. And this is going to be your job, and I'm going to do my job, and we're all going to do our jobs, and then like society will work wonderfully. And then we've got our hunters who are like, I'm bored of my job. I want to do something else. And the farmers were like, no. You have to, if you want to be outside instead of being indoors, you can deliver mail. Become a postal worker. And so our society since the Industrial Revolution got heavily shaped by farmers. And so what ended up happening is our society became more and more methodical, more structured, where everyone is the cog in their, in the particular machine that they're a part of. And the farmers love that kind of thing. They're like, fantastic. Like everyone is a cog. There's perfect order. There is stability, and the world is going well. And then there's a group of people who are the hunters who started to struggle in this society. So they actually started to like move into potentially like more dynamic professions, right? So as schooling got implemented, we started selecting for people who can sit in a chair from 8 to 3. So now we started selecting people for their ability to sit in a chair. And then we added college, which is like, okay, who is like farmer enough to not be forced into learning and can kind of learn on their own. So then we added something like a GPA, right? And what we did is we selected for people in college who are like not dynamic. They're people who can force themselves to go to class, or they don't have to force themselves. They like going to class because they're structured. They go to their 8 a.m. class, they study on time, they do everything on time, they don't procrastinate, and we're going to reward these people. So over time, what happened is society became pro-farmer. And then we did something interesting. Okay, what we did is we took the hunter kids in school and we said, oh my God, these hunter kids they're not able to sit and do what they're supposed to, right? And so then we started diagnosing them with ADHD. So there's a couple of interesting things here. The first is that studies have been done that the student-teacher ratio determines the likelihood of getting diagnosed with ADHD. If you have one teacher to 30 students versus one teacher to 15 students, ADHD will be like twice as likely to be diagnosed in this group than this group. And that's controlling for number of kids. So if I have let's put it this way. Like if I have 2 classrooms, one that has 30 kids and 2 teachers and one that has 30 kids and 1 teacher, like the number of ADHD diagnoses in this classroom is going to be way higher. And so what we begin to see is something that's interesting about a disorder, which is that a disorder, especially mental illnesses, disorders aren't just disorders by themselves. A disorder evolves when there's a genetic vulnerability plus environmental circumstance. So what we see in ADHD is that if you literally look at the term disorder, there's a lack of order or function within a particular environment. And so for people who have ADHD, what it is their mind is dynamic, right? So that may be the genetic vulnerability. They may be a hunter. And what we're doing is we're putting them in a classroom, right? We're sticking them on a farm. And so this is where the disorder arises within this gap. And this is what ADHD is. Now, this is where we have to go back for a second to our bell curve and acknowledge that, like, for a lot of people that I work with ADHD, it's about finding the right environment for them to thrive in, and then their illness no longer becomes a disorder. It can actually become a disadvantage. an advantage. But there are certainly people who have very disordered attention to where, like, they really it is like feels like a very serious like illness to me. But I would say that the majority of people that I work with ADHD, even though it is an illness or a disorder or makes their life hard, that I would say like 2/3 of them, about 70% of them, can function very well with their ADHD in the right circumstance. And in fact, it's even advantageous. So there are some professions that we'll talk about. So event planner is actually surprisingly one. Other examples are like Twitch streamer, esports athlete. So there are actually a lot of professions, even working in the emergency room, that are being a paramedic, being a plumber. There are several professions that, bizarrely enough, seem to like work totally fine with people with ADHD. And there are some situations where ADHD and having a dynamic mindset, because remember that the reason you're getting diagnosed is because you're unable to sit in a classroom for like 7 hours a day, right? So like there are even some professions which are actually geared towards ADHD. And if you actually like go back and watch all of the interviews we've done with streamers, what you'll find is that like a greater percentage of streamers compared to the normal population have ADHD just based on their own self-report, right? Like so many people like will say like, oh yeah, I have ADHD. And it turns out that this kind of hunter mentality can actually be advantageous in some situations. So just to kind of recap, I think the key point here is that there are two kinds of people. There's like farmers and there are hunters. And when you stick a hunter in a farmer society, you'll create an environmental circumstance that allows their dynamic mind to start to become like a disorder or not function well. There's also sort of evidence to this where like when kids get individualized attention, they're able to perform better in school and don't get kind of evaluated or diagnosed for ADHD. So there's a lot of stuff about like, you know, just the amount of structure that people can tolerate. The other thing that tends to go on in a lot of schools is that people will medicate children for the purpose of obedience, right? So like if I'm a teacher and I've got like 30 rowdy kids and I medicate the 5 rowdiest of them, then it's like easy for me to like teach my class, right? And what we tend to see is like the most disruptive kids get diagnosed with ADHD because they can't restrain their attention. So next thing that we're going to talk about is like, what is attention deficit disorder, ADD or ADHD? And we're going to talk a little bit about some myths around ADHD and some like tricky things about diagnosis. So the first thing to understand is that it is a disorder of attention. Okay, so this is where a lot of people get tripped up. So disorders of attention, basically the way that I think about it, is an inability to control your attention. So the lack of this understanding is why I think ADHD is the most overdiagnosed and the most underdiagnosed psychiatric diagnosis. And you may wonder, how can something be overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed at the same time? The reason that you can have that is because you get a lot of people who don't have the disorder that are getting a diagnosis, and you are missing a lot of the people that do have a diagnosis, but you don't catch it because of other things. So here are a couple of common misnomers about ADHD that people don't get. The first is that people with ADHD can't focus. This is actually incorrect. So with ADHD, we see a disorder of attention. So what we see with ADHD is actually hyperfocus plus a lack of focus. So what is actually very common in people with ADHD is that they can sit and do one activity for 4 hours at a stretch, provided it is the right activity. So what you see is a disorder of attention where once an ADHD kid is doing something, it is very, very hard to get them to change gears. So once they almost have like an obsessive quality to their attention. Okay? So this is one of the reasons that it gets misdiagnosed, because like parents will be sitting there with their kids and they'll be like, he never pays attention to school, but once he starts playing with Legos, like you have to physically pull him away. Like it is so hard to get his attention once they are doing something that they're super into. So this sort of disruption of focus, or this like inability to control your attention, can result in hyperfocus. And it's because parents or teachers or other people will see the hyperfocus. They'll even see it with a particular subject. It's like, My kid can't pay attention in math, but like as long as it's history, he can sit there and read books. Like you can give him like a history book at the age of 7 and he'll like read it for 4 hours at a time. So people with ADHD can absolutely hyperfocus on particular things. And in this situation, it can also be like maladaptive because you can't change your focus. You can't stop studying history and start studying mathematics. Plus a lack of focus. So when it comes to mathematics, you have, once again, like an inability to focus. So when I think about disordered attention, when I think about ADHD, I think about disordered attention. When I think about disordered attention, it is both a combination of hyperfocus and lack of focus, okay? So the next thing to kind of think a little bit about is, let me just think for a second. Whether I want to say anything about this. Does this make sense to people? Okay. So the next thing to talk a little bit about, I'm going to go over just a couple of other like reasons why ADHD is misdiagnosed. So the first is that we just kind of talked about is that ADHD kids sometimes hyperfocus. Therefore, people think, oh, since they're capable of hyperfocus, they don't actually have ADHD. So other reasons are good grades. So oftentimes what you'll have is kids with ADHD who have high IQs plus ADHD. And what this results in is good grades. And just because a kid is like brute force IQing their way through things or develops compensatory mechanisms for studying, so like they're not actually able to sit and focus, but they may develop all kinds of compensatory mechanisms like group studying. Another example is self-medication with drugs. Another example is being a night owl. And you may wonder, what does being a night owl have to do with ADHD? Well, let me explain to you. So people with ADHD sometimes find that a certain amount of fatigue slows down their mind and allows them to study. Right? And so you'll also see this kind of pattern. Well, they'll do other things to slow their mind down, either drugs or they'll even play video games. They'll do things that kind of make them like half exhausted so that their mind is able to like sit properly. So we see a lot of misdiagnosis actually because kids have good grades, because kids are smart. So we miss the diagnosis. Another reason that we've already talked about is things like class size. So this is another reason why kids are diagnosed with ADHD is because like, there's just too many kids in the class. And so normally, like if you think about a 6-year-old, like a 6-year-old is only supposed to be able to hold their attention for a certain amount of time. But depending on external pressures, class size, things like that, you can actually get like overdiagnosis of ADHD. There's also, remember, another reason that it's misdiagnosed is like, how can I say this? Like development idiosyncrasies. So remember that the primary regions of the brain that are involved in ADHD are the frontal lobes, or executive function, which if you guys watch either of my other lectures on depression or addiction, you'll realize this statement is a huge oversimplification because we go over all the different regions of the brain that ADHD affects. So executive dysfunction is kind of what we're looking at, right? And so we also have to remember that like kids develop at different rates. So not all 7-year-olds are going to behave the same, right? Just like height or appetite or puberty or all manner of other like developmental milestones, our frontal lobe's ability and our executive dysfunction or function develops at its own idiosyncratic rate. And so some people are just like, some people start puberty early, some people start puberty late. In the same way, some people's frontal lobes develop earlier, some people's frontal lobes develop later. Like I see this even in my 2 kids because my older kid has like a super developed frontal lobe for her age. And my younger kid, like by comparison, doesn't have frontal lobe that's quite as developed or not anywhere near. And that's just like individually the way they are. Like the younger one will get there and it's just going to take her some amount of time. So there are developmental idiosyncrasies that will cause people to diagnose kids with ADHD, and you may get a label. And once you get a label, you're like, oh, I have ADHD, even though as your frontal lobe develops, you may grow out of ADHD. And if you guys kind of think like, how is it possible to grow out of ADHD? Just think about the attention span of a 2-year-old versus 4-year-old versus 14-year-old versus 40-year-old. right? The attention span naturally changes over time. So even if you get diagnosed at the age of 12 with ADHD, you may not have ADHD when you're 22. It doesn't necessarily have to be a lifelong diagnosis. So this is another reason that people get misdiagnosed with ADHD. So class size or environment. So there's another thing that oftentimes, like, these are the ways in which ADHD gets this is why it gets misdiagnosed. This is sort of how it gets misdiagnosed. So what I mean by that is that a lot of times, like, kids with ADHD will be labeled with behavioral problems. Okay, so like you'll get a kid and they'll be like, oh, here's another one actually. So, doesn't listen or is defiant. Okay, this is really, really common. Where remember that the problem with ADHD is like attentional control. So if an ADHD kid is playing with Legos, their parents will say that this person doesn't listen. And oftentimes, like let's say you have a kid with ADHD and you tell them, go wash your hands. And then the kid, like, on the way to the bathroom will get distracted by something because they'll see like a toy on the floor and they'll start picking it up. And they'll start playing with the toy and the parents will get mad at them. Right? And once they get mad at them, they're like you're not listening to me. You never listen. Bad child, bad child, bad child. And so this not listening thing gets sometimes perceived as defiance, and then the punishment that they get then leads to shame and self-esteem problems and a lack of agency. So we talked about this in the depression lecture as well, where a lot of times, like, kids with ADHD will get like punished, or they'll have different kinds of experiences, either social experiences, behavioral experiences, like school experiences. They're perceived as not being obedient, right? So that's kind of like the defiant thing. So we'll get all these kids who actually have ADHD who are labeled as bad kids. So they have behavioral problems, they don't listen, they're defiant, they're argumentative. There are all kinds of problems that these kids will kind of get labeled as, but they don't actually have those problems. They're not being defiant. It's not like the kid is like walking to the bathroom and is like, screw my parents, I'm going to play something. What they end up doing is they just get distracted by something, and then they just get distracted by it, and then they get punished for it. And then they feel bad because they don't even really realize what they did wrong, right? They sort of connect the dots afterward, but in the moment, their mind just like switches gears and they forget. There's another thing. They get perceived as forgetful. Right? So, like, this person is just forgetful. Like, their memory is terrible. I've even had this. So I one time had a dude come into my office and say, like, I think I may have dementia. And the dude was like in his like late 20s. And I was like, why do you think you have dementia? I was like, that's bizarre. Like, I don't hear that every day. They're like, well, my memory is just terrible. And I was like, well, tell me about that. And he's like, well, my wife tells me I forget stuff all the time. So we started talking about it. And then, like, the more that I realized, like, oh, this guy doesn't have a memory problem. He has like an attention problem. So this is where, if we remember, so if we think about like memories stored in our brain, let's say this is where memories are stored. Remember, they have to get put in somewhere, and then they have to get recalled. And so if this is missing, or you can't recall it properly, we think, oh, like I wasn't able to recall it. But the truth is, it never got planted in the first place. So a good example of this is if someone tells me, if I ask, okay, so this is a classic example, okay? The easy example of understanding attention versus recall. Who here meets a bunch of people at a party and forgets their names, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a bunch of people. It can even be one person. You meet one person, you're like, hey, my name is Alok, and they say, my name is whatever. And like, it never even sinks in. Like, and you're like, oh shit, I forgot that person's name. Right? And it's like, how can you forget that person's name so quickly? Like, within 5 seconds of introducing yourself, you forget their name. Within 2 seconds of introducing yourself, you're like, what was that person's name again? And then they just introduced themselves. You've already forgotten the name, so you don't like think that you're like, oh, well, it's stupid. I can't just ask them like right away, like, what is your name? Right? So why does that happen? It's an intentional thing, because when you introduce yourselves, your attention is on your introduction, so you're not listening to them. So the name never gets implanted in your brain in the first place. Right? So it's never being entered in. And so this is why people with ADHD have, like, they get perceived as forgetful. It's not because they have any problem with recall. They don't have dementia. It's just that their attention is wandering, so the stuff never gets put in the first place. Okay? So this is like when we kind of look at the misdiagnosis of ADHD, or let's start from the top. So like ADHD essentially is a disorder of attention, and that attentional disorder can result in hyperfocus, which leads to a lot of misdiagnosis, because parents are like, oh, like, he can like do Roblox all day long. No big deal. Also gaming. Right? So let's talk about gaming in a second, but it's both hyperfocus plus a lack of focus. It tends to get misdiagnosed or missed in a lot of people due to their ability to get good grades, which oftentimes has to do with like compensatory mechanisms that they'll set up. Can get misdiagnosed due to things like class size or environment. Because remember, a psychiatric diagnosis tends to be a vulnerability plus an environmental factor combined. And then another reason that it gets misdiagnosed is because people just develop at their own pace. So it's like you can't expect all 7-year-olds to be able to sit in the classroom at the same level, right? Some kids are going to really love it. Some kids, it's going to be hard. And then like people will sort of grow out of it. So oftentimes kids with ADHD get misdiagnosed with things like behavioral problems like, oh, they don't listen, they get punished for defiance or lack of obedience, for being forgetful. Oh, my kid is like, they're just completely forgetful. Like I can't rely on them for, to remember anything. And it's not an issue of recall, it's an issue of attention. So let's talk about gaming for a second and ADHD. Why do kids with ADHD love gaming? It's because games demand your attention. Okay? So like this is the cool thing about a video game, right? Like it doesn't ever kind of get boring. It just like, and people with ADHD will self-select for particular video games that will demand their attention in the right way. So the game is constantly giving you stimuli, right? So it's like, oh, like there's a random encounter here. If I'm playing like Fortnite or a battle royale, like now there's someone over here. Or like I can queue up for a game of League, and there's always like some kind of thing that is like triggering and pulling in your attention. And so this is also where people will get misdiagnosed, because parents will be like, I don't understand why my kid can't study. He can sit there and literally play on a computer for like 12 hours, like without stopping for food. And that is once again because it is disordered attention. Right? So they can hyperfocus. So video games are very, very addictive to people with ADHD because they allow your mind to be fully focused, and it's sort of like a never-ending like ability to get focused. And this is where we can almost take a quick spiritual detour, and we can acknowledge that if you look at like old texts on yoga and meditation, they say that focus equals bliss. That the happy mind is not an anxious mind or a distracted mind, but a focused mind. So if you do something like watch a sunset, why do sunsets look so cool? It's because they like allow you to focus your mind. If we look at the nature of like, unhappiness in the mind, it's usually like unfocused thoughts. So a good example of this is anxiety, where you're thinking about one thing and you're thinking about another thing and you're thinking about a third thing. You may think that it's all the same thought, but if you really pay attention to anxiety, it's actually rapidly moving thoughts. You may be anxious about a party, but you may think, oh, does that mean that I'm focused on the party? No, if you actually pay attention to your thoughts, you're not focused on the party. When you have anxiety about going to a party, you're like, oh, what if I'm wearing the wrong thing? And then what if people think I'm stupid? And then people won't like me. And who am I going to talk to? Am I going to be standing in the corner with a drink, not talking to myself, and everyone's going to think I'm a loser? And then like I'm going to walk up and try to join a conversation, and that's going to seem super awkward because I'm just like walking up and not saying anything. So you kind of think about like all these 15 different things. It's not one thought. It's not like watching a sunset where you're not like thinking, oh, like the sunset has this sunspot here, and then it's got this, and then it's got this, and then it's got this. You're just absorbed in the experience. So the yogis sort of figured out that focus equals bliss. And if you can be absorbed in one thing, that will lead to a mental feeling of like calmness and enjoyment. And so this is what's so addictive about gaming, is that gaming sort of gives us a sense of focus. And so even though the game is rage-inducing, we find ourselves drawn to it. Why? Because we can be absorbed within it, right? So like a good example of this is like if you play something like Dark Souls, like while you're fighting the boss, you have like laser focus, and it's after you get one-shotted that you throw your controller down and smash everything, right? But it's the because when you get one shot at in Dark Souls, what happens? It shatters your beautiful focus. When you're playing like League of Legends or Valorant or whatever, you're like hyper focused, and it's when your teammate ints down mid that it shatters your focus, and then you start raging. Why? Because this thing gets taken away from you. Okay? So we see kind of that gaming and ADHD are like really, really great because they take your disordered attention and allow you to hyper focus on it so easily. And the mind just loves that from a spiritual perspective. By spiritual perspective, I mean this is sort of like the way that the yogis looked at things. It's not really like scientific in the sense that they didn't do like, a randomized controlled trial on 10,000 humans. What they did is look at themselves with like 10,000 intensity. They took an N of 1 and explored it all the way down to the core. Okay? So now let's talk a little bit, since we're on the topic of gaming, so now let's talk a little bit about like being ADHD in the modern world. Okay, and why is this important? It's because if we look at our world is changing rapidly. So remember that the Industrial Revolution basically made us a society of farmers. Right? Where everyone is a cog in the wheel, or cog in the machine. Right? We have 9 to 5. All this other stuff. There's this idea of high school, college, career. Even the word career. You guys get this? The word career implies like one thing that you do for your entire life. It's a farmer-biased word. You guys get that? It's not like, and then there's like the opposite is odd jobs, right? Like, and so you guys see like the value judgment difference between these two things. So if you look at someone like Elon Musk, like he doesn't have a career. He's a dude with odd jobs. Y'all get that? Like Bill Gates had a career. Elon Musk has odd jobs. He's like, I'm gonna start a company that sends people into space. I'm going to start an electric car company. I'm going to start a company that drills into the ground and like high-speed rail transport like on California. Right? So like this is where if we look at the Industrial Revolution and the consequence of the Industrial Revolution, what we see is that like there's such a heavy bias about what is successful and what is good versus what is bad. And it's very, very farmer focused. It's very anti-hunter. Okay? But now, like, the world is changing. So, like, I'll just give you guys a couple of examples, okay? So, like, what tends to happen is, over time, our attention can transform. So we can, make our attention more farmer-like. Or we can go over here and make it more hunter-like. So there are studies that have been done which basically show that, like, short content makes people more ADHD. So there are studies that show that, like, so people will sometimes ask me, okay, is it okay if my kid, like, uses a screen? And they're like, what do you think about screen time, Dr. K? And that's where, like, I know it sounds kind of weird, but not all screen time is the same. Like, there's no such thing. I mean, there is something as screen time, but how you use the screen makes a big difference. Oh my God, that's just completely illegible, chat. Even that's too much for me. So, for example, what I'll advise parents to do is long-form content on a screen is fine. So, for example, a movie is okay, but YouTube compilations are bad. And let's just think about this. So, like, if I spend my days watching movies, my brain is literally going to be entrained to pay attention to something over long periods of time. If I watch YouTube compilations, my attention is shifting like every 60 seconds. So ads are another thing that makes things like more hunter-like, increases the dynamic nature of our mind. So now let's look at a couple of different things, okay? So like let's look at a couple of categories. Let's talk about content. Then let's talk about discussion, okay? And then let's talk about dating. So let's look at like how these things have progressed over time. So back in the day, if I wanted content, what I had to do was read a book, right? And this was like a 30-hour endeavor. And then what happened? Someone like invented television where they're like, oh, look, there's a TV show. And now it's like a 1 hour endeavor. Right? And then someone came along and invented YouTube. And now it's like anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. Right? And then someone came along and was like, hey, let's do this live. And they invented Twitch. Now you can watch a stream for like 8 hours at a stretch, but like, you know, there's an increase in the dynamic nature of Twitch. Right? And which content platform is growing the most rapidly? There it is. Good job. TikTok, which is like less than 60 seconds, bro. So what's happening is like we are actually selecting for shorter and shorter attention spans. So as kids start watching TikTok, and if we kind of look at the ADHD diagnosis, ADHD has been increasing all along, right? Over time. If we go down this way, we'll see an increase in ADHD diagnosis. Next thing to kind of think about, let's think about like discussions, for lack of a better term. So it used to be like people talking. Like, the Roman Senate. And then like people hanging out on porches, right? So these were like long things, like people would talk for hours. And then what's happening is like the internet comes along, and then we have these things called discussion forums, which if you still go to places like RPG Codex, you'll see like discussion forums that are like years old, right? You'll have a thread that's like years old where people are still talking about it. And then over time, we even get things like Reddit, where it's like, so there's some discussion, but the discussion like tends to happen like temporarily or shortly. And then we end up with things like Twitch and Twitter, which is like, if you blink, you'll miss chat, right? And so we see the same thing. Oh no, we're lagging. GG. We may have to move. We see things like Twitch and Twitter where like the discussion rate is very, very rapid. And let's even talk about dating. Okay? So dating, there used to be courtship. This is like a long and drawn out process of like balls and meetings and things like that. And then after the courtship process, like years later, centuries later, we started this thing called dating. Right? So people will say, oh, are you walking out with someone, or whatever terminology they used. And then like dating is like a little bit more dynamic. You meet a couple more people. You kind of do, it takes a couple months, maybe a couple years. Like courtship is like more structured. And then after dating, more recently, I'd say in the last 20, 30 years, like as the availability of birth control kind of increased, we sort of have like a hookup culture, right? Where like it's no longer just about getting married. Like you don't even need to get married. You can just like date for the sake of dating, and you can like hook up just to have a good time. Like there's no value judgment attached to it. And now we have Tinder. And in the courtship, you're like dealing with one person. In the dating thing, let's say you're dealing with like 3 to 5 people. In the hookup culture, maybe you're dealing with like 5 to 20, depending on, oh God, once again, terrible handwriting. And then like Tinder, it's like literally a numbers game. So it's like 99 plus, right? So we see that society is like moving in this direction. As we move in this direction, we're going to see an increase in ADHD-like symptoms. Oh my God. Chat. Dr. K is on the struggle bus today. And as we see an increase in ADHD-like symptoms, like we're going to see like more people feeling like they have ADHD. But something interesting is also happening, which is that society is moving away from the farmers. So, have you guys read anything by like Charles Dickens? Right? Like there's like back in the day of like book writing, or like Tolstoy, very, very like long attention span authors and long attention span like consumers of content. And so what's happening over time is that we're getting like going down this way where like as society becomes ADHD, the more ADHD mindset becomes more advantageous. So this is where like it's been my experience, for example, with Twitch streamers, that the average Twitch streamer is more ADHD than the average like person. And what that actually does for them is actually gives them a competitive advantage. So even this kind of stuck out with me. We did an interview with the Daily Dose of the Internet dude. And so if you like think about the DDOI guy, like what he basically does is like uses his own attention span as a judge for what the internet will like or not like, right? So his attention span becomes a tool instead of a problem. Now remember, he still exists in a primarily farmer society where there's like bank accounts and monthly payments and this and that and mortgages and credit scores and all this stuff. So we're not saying that like it's necessarily an advantage, but I have seen that like as we get more and more Twitter oriented, our attention spans seem to be shorter. So if you look at political discourse over time, right? So it started off with like, let's say the Roman Senate, where people go and construct arguments and like will discuss for hours and hours at a time. And now we've got like Twitter trolls, right? Who will just make like bizarre political statements that no one fact checks, has no nuance, and just incites emotion. So it's almost like being ADHD means that you can't be a senator in ancient Rome, but having ADHD in today's society makes you a political pundit. Like, it's easy, right? So this is like a good example of how our society is actually moving more towards ADHD. We're sort of cultivating a shorter attention span, but bizarrely, actually, this may serve as an advantage for those of you who feel like you've got ADHD. And so there are a couple of other trends, for example, that like some companies have embraced. So I don't know if you guys know this, but like Google, for example, last time I checked, or based on the clients I've worked on, does not have a 9-to-5 work culture. They're like, we don't care when you come in. You can work at like 2 a.m. if you want to. It just needs to get done on time. Like, we don't care like when you come in. And so Google also sort of figured out that like, okay, we're just going to give our engineers like a cafeteria and a place that's open 24 hours. And they can come and work wherever they want to. So they've sort of selected for the night owls. And they did something really cool here because remember, in the 9-to-5 work culture, like these people would not be able to get a job or they wouldn't be able to keep a job, even though they're super talented and could be very good programmers. And so by Google sort of stepping away from the farmer culture and moving towards like a more free culture, they actually allow these people that may be a little bit more ADHD, maybe late risers, maybe circadian rhythm disorder folks, to actually be productive programmers. Another example of this is actually work from home, right? So work from home, like more and more people are moving towards work from home, which is like, you may wonder, okay, what does that have to do with ADHD? But it's like a less structured environment, right? So we're moving away from structure towards dynamic work environments. And the more that we move in those directions, I think the more that the ADHD crowd will be like more able to like do a good job. So I'll give you guys just a very simple example of how work from home like supports ADHD. So remember, people with ADHD have hyperfocus or disordered focus or lack of focus, right? And the problem if you've got ADHD, you guys may know this, is that like, you know, your typical day is like waiting to get inspired to work, panicking, procrastinating, and then every now and then you get a 4-hour window you get these 4 magical hours where you do 24 hours of work. You guys know what I mean? And so it's like you just like wake up one day and you're like, let's go. And then you just do all the work. And then like for the rest of the week, you're trying to figure out, why couldn't I do that on Monday? Like, when is that going to happen again? And so the work from home culture allows these people to succeed. Because if you're like an ADHD person, you have to work from 9 to 5. Like, what happens if your magical 4 hours doesn't happen in that window? You're screwed. You're never going to get promoted. You're going to get fired. It's like GG. So as we work from home, it's sort of like you just kind of work from home. You can be in your pajamas, but if you get a flash of inspiration, what used to happen is you get a flash of inspiration. Oh no, got to change out of my pajamas, put on my suit, commute for an hour. And by the time you get to the office, it's like you're hungry, over caffeinated, and like it's shattered. Your muse is gone. And now in the work from home environment, it's like if you get that flash of inspiration, it's like you don't even need to put on pants. You just sit down and like bang out, like you program like a madman for 4 hours. And then you can go and like get some pizza afterward. Right? And so like our society is actually moving in an unstructured environment. Things are getting more ADHD. But on the flip side, if your attention span is more in this realm, you may actually find that you have some competitive advantages. Questions? So just to kind of summarize, okay? So let's like do major points. First of all, ADHD exists for a reason, right? And this goes into why society needs farmers and hunters. Okay? Generally speaking, ADHD gets over and under diagnosed. Okay? So it gets misinterpreted in a lot of ways. What is it? It's a disorder of attention, which means hyperfocus plus lack of focus. And this confuses a lot of people. Point number 3, society is increasing ADHD. But on the flip side, if you have ADHD, you may actually have an advantage, as long as you're careful about making it an advantage. Okay? So this is why people are ADHD. If this kind of resonates with you, like now hopefully you have a big high order sense of like why things are this way. And also like just think a lot about this point especially. So when I work with individuals, what I'll really do is work really hard to try to figure out, okay, like what is your unique like advantage that you can bring to a particular work environment or your goals or whatever. And what I found time and time again is that we don't need to medicate them to turn them into like essentially farmers. What it's really about, and sometimes they still need medication, but what it's really about is creating sort of a life or structure that allows your dynamic mind to be an advantage instead of a disadvantage. Okay? Questions? Can you have low attention span without ADHD? Absolutely. Right? So like that's what I'm saying is that as a whole, society is shrinking our attention span. Y'all get that? Because you don't need an attention span the way that you used to. Like entertainment used to involve reading a book. So like think about this. Every time that like 200 years ago, every time someone read a book, what they're doing is training their attention span to be longer. And now if I'm just like chain watching stuff, like, and that too, you can tell there are different kinds of content consumers. There's the long form podcast content consumer. There's the high energy Twitch chat consumer. And there's like something in the middle, which is like the 25-minute video essay on YouTube. And so depending on where your attention span is, you may gravitate towards a particular kind of content. And depending on which kind of content you watch, you will be training your attention span a particular way. If all you watch is YouTube compilations of memes, a podcast is going to feel super boring. What if I watch both? Well, that's totally normal, right? So like the mind doesn't always want the same kind of thing. So there's also a variation in like how consistently you like your content. Like some people only like to read books and can't stand movies. And some people are like, I like Game of Thrones books. I like Game of Thrones TV show. And season 8 is the best season of television that has ever been created in the history of humanity. There's variation within populations. Right? It's truly a masterpiece. Right? So now we understand like the advantage. So this, by the way, so I love lecturing like in person. So like I love teaching, but like I can't make a YouTube video for the life of me. Like I just can't sit down. Like I've tried it 1,000 times where I'm just like talking to the camera. I just can't do it. I need some amount of like actual energy to like keep my mind going. So someone's saying, I thought drugs were a big part of treatment for ADHD. So oftentimes medicine is used for ADHD. So let's go over like basic evidence around ADHD treatments. Okay, first thing to understand is that medication is as effective as therapy. So if you go to like a cognitive behavioral therapist who teaches you how to focus your mind and like map things out and all these other skills, you can learn skills that are just as effective as taking like Adderall or methylphenidate or whatever, as taking ADHD medication. This is something that is very, very poorly like understood in society, is that you can get the benefit of medication without medication. Like the effect sizes are the same. Second thing to understand is that the reason that people do medication is because it's easy, right? So it's like very easy, especially if you've got a 13-year-old, like taking your 13-year-old to therapy twice a week so they can entrain the right kind of skills is like very expensive and cumbersome. It's like you got to get in the car, drive them to their appointment. They have an hour-long appointment. As a parent, you have to wait around, pick them up, and bring them home. So it's like a 2-hour investment twice a week, which is like 4 hours, and it's just easier to medicate them. And it's like the medication works right away. Right? The kids love it too. You guys are just bashing on the parents. Like, the kids love it. They're like, I take a pill and suddenly my mind works like everyone else's. That's easy. I don't want to sit here and map out my week for an hour twice a week. It's torture. Does that make sense? Other questions? Is that why adults get meds? Since their brains are already developed, it's harder to train those skills? No, so sort of. So the reason that adults get meds is because their brain is naturally developed maybe as much as it will. But even then, your frontal lobes develop until the age of about 30 or 32. And I suspect that we're even delaying the amount of time that it takes our frontal lobes to mature. So I think that if you do a study in 10 years about when the frontal lobes mature, they'll mature by 35. So I think that's changing. So our frontal lobes are maturing slowly than before, or there's more maturation to be had. The reason that adults get meds, sure, you just can't count on your frontal lobes developing more if you're like over 32. But they can train those skills in CBT just as well as kids can. So most of the studies are done in adults. So that's not the issue. The issue is, once again, if you're an adult, it's just easier, right? What's the link to... is there any link between giftedness and ADHD? That's an excellent question, and one that we're actively researching right now. So we do a lot of different research here at HG, and we're actually looking into that question. So we've noticed that there's a lot of people in our community who are gifted kids, and there are a lot of people in our community who have ADHD. So is there an overlap? It's something we're actively investigating. How do I confirm if I have ADHD or not? You go get a professional evaluation. So someone's saying, Dr. Russell Barkley makes the point that medication for ADHD is like providing a wheelchair to someone with a mobility issue. I completely agree. And let's just look at that statement more closely. So providing a wheelchair to someone with a mobility issue is like more complicated than it seems. So depending on the mobility issue, is this person able to walk? Like, have they been in a car accident and they need to go to rehab and learn to walk again? Or are they missing their legs? Can they learn to use prostheses? So much like ADHD is providing a wheelchair, sometimes you need a wheelchair and sometimes that person will need the wheelchair for the rest of their life. But there are populations of people that we are sticking in wheelchairs and we're never teaching them how to walk again. And so that's a problem, because I think much like mobility issues, there's a differential diagnosis for what's causing your mobility issue, and there are different treatment options to address your mobility issue. It may be a prosthetic, it may be a wheelchair, it may be that you can walk without either. You just have to train it up the right way. Why do people say ADHD is fake? So you'd probably have to ask them, first of all. But I'd say it has to do with a lot of the misdiagnosis stuff that I talked about earlier. So ADHD is oftentimes perceived as a different kind of problem. Like, oh, this person is defiant or isn't listening. The other reason that I think people say ADHD is fake is because they have a neurotypical brain And so like it's easy for them. They take it for granted that their mind is able to focus. And they cannot imagine a world in which their mind just like gets unplugged at random times or switches the channel on you, right? So like imagine that you're watching television and you control what channel you're watching. And then like imagine a different scenario where like your channel randomly changes. If you've had a remote control your entire life, it can be very hard for you to understand that like other people's channels are just randomly changing and they have no control over that. It's such a given in their life that they have some degree of attentional control. What are the downsides to meds? There are some downsides. It's very kind of individualistic. So like remember that prescribing medication is about a balance of benefits versus hindrances. So I try to steer clear of medications in general. Like, so about 30% of people in my practice have medication. I have no value judgment. Like, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be on medication. I prescribe this stuff after all. But I think that oftentimes, like I was saying with the wheelchair analogy, that medication will sometimes be a substitute for some amount of like growth or change, which sometimes people just don't have the bandwidth for. Like I have a patient, for example, who's got like, 2 teenagers and they just don't have the time to like do yoga and like a juice cleanse, right? So it's like, just take your SSRI. Like, don't worry about it. Like you can take care of yourself like down the road. But right now you have like more important things to worry about. So medication is like useful because it is easy, right? So with ADHD, for example, some of the things that I get concerned about is the brain development, but we don't really know exactly how stimulants affect brain development over time. It's not clear that it's really harmful at all. There are definitely concerns for a lot of stimulant medication with being underweight and appetite suppression. So remember, when you take a medication, it gets dissolved and distributed throughout your entire body. So medications will have effects in many places besides your brain. And so one example of like stimulant medication is that it suppresses appetite. So if you have a 13-year-old who is undergoing a growth spurt, and normally they're consuming a high amount of calories, and you give them like ADHD medication, sometimes they won't feel as hungry. How will that affect their long-term growth? So it does appear that there are weight changes that happen with ADHD medication, which you have to be careful about. That's just one example. So would you recommend a forcefully extended attention span? It depends on where you are on the spectrum. So I'd recommend that you should be in control of your attention span. And so if you tell your mind to do something, it should listen. So if I tell it, hey, it's time to stream, forget about Dota, it should listen. It can kick and scream a little bit like mine did today, but then it sort of gets in gear. If you tell it, hey, it's time to study, it should sit and listen. That's what I'd recommend. How do you deal with an inferiority complex caused by ADHD? So I don't know if you've seen the ADHD and depression lecture, but I'd start by watching that. You can also check out Dr. K's guide to depression. So for those of y'all that are dealing with inferiority complexes, so the guide to depression has a lot of stuff about some scars and like the way that those complexes form, which maybe we can talk about today. But there's like more detail about how to digest those, dissolve those, etc. in the guide. We'll talk about that today, though. Some scars, excellent. Someone's doing their homework. Okay, shall we move on? So, bro, I'm dealing with every complex and it ain't pretty. Like, I get that. That's why in the guide, we talk about how to deal with all of the complexes. So this is something that I like about Eastern psychology more so than Western psychology. So Western psychology is really good at like diagnosing the content of the mind. So I'll say like, oh, this person has an Oedipal complex. This person has narcissistic personality disorder. This person, like has borderline personality disorder. This person is a sociopath or psychopath. So they're really good at like describing the content of the person's mind. But I think Eastern psychology has a better handle on the process of mind. So how fundamentally does a complex form? Where do complexes come from? And how do we get rid of them? And then the particulars of it are like whatever you want. But that's why like we kind of go into detail. We'll talk about this today. I'll teach something about it. But if you guys are interested in this, that's why we have 5 of the common sum scars that lead to depression. So these are 5 complexes that people experience that cause them to be depressed. One example is like, I'm hopeless, therefore like there's no point in doing anything. It's almost this nihilism doomer complex. Another example is falling behind. I've fallen behind. Therefore, like it's too late. So there are a lot of different things that you can kind of examine. So if you guys are interested in the nature of how complexes form, like definitely check out the depression guide. Okay, let's talk about how do I deal with micromanaging parents and the consequences in my mid-20s. We'll talk about it. We'll do a holiday stream about parents and micromanagement or something. Let me think about that. Okay. What is the 6th, 7th, 8th of common sum scars? So we'll work on it. I think we may have some stuff coming out for y'all soon. So someone saying structure and discipline are hard, need tips. So this is where I'd say, agreed, structure and discipline are hard, but remember that you don't necessarily have to rely on structure and discipline, right? You can rely on like inspiration and environment. So what I'd say is if you guys have difficulties, here's like a quick nutshell. If you have difficulties with structure and discipline, and that's not what you're good at, just don't bother in a weird way. So all the discipline you need is like set up a study group, for example. And then like just make all the discipline you need is not to study for 8 hours. Because if you're studying by yourself, right, like you are going to, if you're studying by yourself, every hour you have to make a check, like a willpower check. And if you fail your check, you start playing a video game. But if you're studying with a group of friends, like you just have to make one willpower check to get there, and then they will keep you involved. When I say inspire, that's where your company is very important. If you're around a bunch of people who are like, entrepreneurs, like you will naturally have a more entrepreneurial bend. If you're around a bunch of people who are like game developers, and like there's a Discord server for game development, and you hang out on that Discord instead of like a League of Legends Discord, you're more likely to develop games in one than the other, right? The LOL Discord is going to cause you to play games. The development Discord server is going to cause you to make games. Okay, let's do another one. Wait, do you guys want to talk about this, or you guys want to just like keep talking questions, or what? We've got other stuff. Like we've got stuff about comparison. Poll? Poll? Anyone? Let me see if I can figure out how to do a poll. All right. What is this, Paul? What is this thing? This fish? What do? It's pretty close. Keep going. Oh no. Okay, people want us to keep going. Okay. What effect does weed have on ADHD? Not a good one. In essence. All right? So like weed is like not a very good drug. Especially if you have a developing brain. Like if you want to become 35, you have your life established, and then you want to like use weed and it's legal and stuff, I'd say go for it. So I'd say that we'll do comparison. We'll answer questions for like 10 more minutes, and then we'll do comparison, okay? So like cannabis is one of these. Why does cannabis feel like it helps? Because it does help certain things, and it screws you over in other ways. So like the reason that cannabis feels like it helps is because it helps. It just also hurts. right? So like it's almost just like the ADHD medication in the wheelchair analogy, where let's say you use cannabis for your anxiety. Like it can help with your anxiety, but then not only will you potentially get rebound anxiety, which is so if you use substances to regular treat anxiety and you take the substance away, you will actually worsen your anxiety. So you get stuck in this cycle of being dependent on the substance, and that doesn't even help anymore. It's like caffeine, where your body develops a tolerance and then there's no net positive. You become dependent on it to function. And then it's not actually helping your anxiety. It's just like you've developed a tolerance. So weed is a problem because it is very, very effective at making your problems go away. The problem is that it makes you feel like your problems go away. It doesn't actually make your problems go away. It makes your problems usually worse. So like people who drown themselves in substances will like, oh, like once I'm drunk, like I can forget all of my cares, but like they're your cares for a reason, right? So you can do that and you can delay the clock by 24 hours, but all the problems are still going to be there. And this is where, a lot of people think that, so that's the basic problem with weed. It also tends to mess with your habit formation circuitry. So like the ability to form good habits is more difficult while you're using marijuana. So there's a common misconception that weed like causes IQ problems. I don't think it causes IQ problems. What it does is far, far more insidious, which is that it causes motivational problems and habit formation problems. Right? That's why there's sort of this idea of a pothead, which is like someone who sits around all day and does nothing. Now, chances are there's a little bit of a reciprocal relationship there, that people who sit around and do nothing gravitate towards pot, and pot makes people want to sit around and do nothing. So it's not all the pot. The other general thing that you should be careful about is like if you have a developing brain and you add substances to it, how does that affect the development of your brain? The short answer is we don't know. So I'd say like steer clear of that stuff, especially if you're like a teenager or even your early 20s. So one person saying, how do I deal with the imposter syndrome of whether I might actually have ADHD or I'm just normal and lazy, especially since the waiting list for formal assessment is so long here. So if you're stuck between trying to figure out, am I lazy or do I have ADHD? Really common problem. Excellent question. What do you do about it? And this is where it's kind of interesting, but the short answer is it sort of doesn't matter, right? So like, I know it sounds kind of weird, but whether you have a diagnostic reason for being the way that you are, or you are lazy, you still have the same shared problem, which is that you're unable to do things. That problem needs to be fixed. Whether you have ADHD or you're lazy, like that's sort of, in a weird way, it's almost irrelevant. It does become relevant because ADHD may open up additional ways to fix it. So I'm not saying it's truly irrelevant, but what I'm saying is that the situation is what it is. The ADHD is just a label that you put upon it, right? It may give you some amount of tools, it may give you some amount of options, but this is where I'd say that, if there are tools to organize yourself with ADHD, they may help you even if you're lazy. So this is where, your situation is what it is, irrespective of what label someone will give you. And so there are things that you can do irrespective of what label you have. Right? So what is the nature and experience of your inability to work? Ask yourself that question. That question is the same whether you have ADHD or don't have ADHD. And then you ask yourself, okay, so what is it that makes it hard for me to work? Is it I feel unmotivated? What does that mean? What does unmotivation mean? Like, what does that mean to feel unmotivated? Is it that your mind is distracted? Is it that you're afraid of the consequences? Is it that when you start to work, like you automatically compare yourself to other people and you think there's no point in studying because this person is going to do a better job than I am? There are all kinds of things that can impact your motivation. And so you have to understand the nature of your experience. You're going to get more answers studying yourself than you will from like getting a particular label and finding external answers. And that may sound weird. You're like, but wait, if I have ADHD, doesn't that mean that there are all of these solutions out there? Newsflash, as someone who treats people with ADHD, they're all on the struggle bus anyway. It certainly can help and there can be transformative interventions that you can do for ADHD. I'm not downplaying those. But I'd say like 70% of people that I diagnose with ADHD still have to go through the process of like self-discovering and figuring out what works for them. And that's because ADHD isn't homogeneous. It's heterogeneous, right? So not everyone's ADHD is the same way. And so at the end of the day, like that personal exploration of what is holding you back, I think is worth way more than getting a label that applies to a mass of people for whom different things may work, right? Because it's not like there's one medication for ADHD. There's like half a dozen. And why is that? It's because different people need different things. So even the label does not fix your problems and magically make them go away. So Dr. K, I limited my caffeine use to 1 drink per day, and now I'm having trouble with motivation and focus. I was self-medicating with it, and I now realize it was helping me function. What else can I do? Cut out that last cup of caffeine, bro. Or girl. You're Fatal Dave, so I assume you're a dude, but you never know. So this is where, like, just cut out the rest of it and get completely off of it. That's the right move. Either go to 2 cups a day or no cups a day. I'm assuming Dave could be a woman. It's fair. The name is masculine. Right? Develop. So if you need it to, so people are wondering why 2 or none. So caffeine has a half-life, which is the amount of time it takes to like metabolize the caffeine, okay? So when you drink a cup of coffee, there's a period of time where like you have a high level of caffeine in which it probably gives you like a work buff. But then over time, the buff declines, and then you may hit this point where it no longer buffs you, and then you can enter a period of caffeine withdrawal, which is a debuff, which is why people sometimes need caffeine twice per day, right? So you get that first buff, and as your level wanes, you get that second afternoon cup of masala chai, and then that carries you through the rest of the day. So you have these 2 peaks. So for some people, 1 cup of coffee is enough to where they get a mild buff, and they kind of their half-life is such that it carries them through the day without a problem. But depending on your individual metabolism, if you're like me and you're a vata, 1 cup is never enough. So it's either 2 or bust. So that has to do with your individual metabolism. Dr. K, do you think diagnosing ADHD during drug addiction is possible? Yes, I think it's possible, but it's hard. So what I would do so the people that I've diagnosed with ADHD who are on drugs are the ones that I usually make a historic diagnosis. So I won't send them for neuropsych testing. I'll ask them or their parents, what was this person like as a kid? And so you can sort of get enough from a history to see, oh, this person probably has ADHD, even though they're on substances now. And that becomes very, very important because oftentimes ADHD itself, being underdiagnosed, can keep someone from ever becoming sober. So there's a whole video on this. We did a lecture on ADHD and addiction where we kind of explored how ADHD is a vulnerability for drug use, right? So if you are impulsive because you have ADHD and your ability to restrain your impulses and act more emotionally, we go through a bunch of neuroscience and stuff like that. There are a lot of reasons why having untreated ADHD makes sobriety very difficult. And so interestingly enough, sometimes what I'll have to do is prescribe people stimulants, get the ADHD under control, even while they're abusing marijuana or opiates. And then once the ADHD gets under control, then they can actually get control of their substance use. So sometimes you have to do it like that. It's tricky. Alcohol can be really bad too for ADHD. Absolutely. Like we said, some people with ADHD use alcohol as a cognitive depressant, right? So it slows your mind down so that you can focus more easily. So do I have ADHD myself? No. I don't think so. I probably would have gotten diagnosed if I was a kid in today's school system with ADHD. So I have a high level of vata, which I think is quite ADHD, but I don't think that my function is impaired. That's partially because of the way that I've structured my environment. I am a vata. So I think if I was in school now, I would there's a 50% chance I would get diagnosed with ADHD. Based on I could never study, I could never if I was interested in something, I could pay attention to it. If not, and I was just kind of smart, so it wasn't that bad of a deal, that big of a deal. Can ADHD patients become top students at competitive universities and scientific fields? Absolutely. Absolutely. I've had those students as my patients. Do Indian schools diagnose ADHD a lot? I don't know. I don't think they definitely don't go by doshas. It's interesting, in India, the understanding of Ayurveda is so divided. Some people are into it and most people are not. So they don't understand, most Indian people don't even understand what a dosha is, based on the people I've talked to. Okay, let's move on. Someone's asking about oxcarbazepine or trileptal causing ADHD or depression. That's definitely a question for your provider. That's the kind of thing where oxcarbazepine and trileptal can definitely cause depressive kind of symptoms, right? But that's definitely something you should, in concentration problems, sure. But that's the kind of discussion you should be having with your provider. That's the specificity of if you guys really want to do a lecture on pharmacology, we can. But, because trileptal is a mood stabilizer, right? So it's going to slow down your action potentials and stuff, which can have a side effect of being depressed and can lead to concentration problems. But I would expect trileptal to cause people to have slow concentration as opposed to rapid stuff. Is it normal for a psychologist to ask for blood work to be checked before they diagnose you with ADHD? I don't know if it's normal or not. Is it smart? Absolutely. What do you look for in blood work? So we did a lecture on this, chat. There are 6 lab tests that everyone in chat should get. You guys should get evaluated for 6 conditions, because 1 out of 2 human beings will have one of these problems. 50% of chat will have one of these problems. Anemia, thyroid problems, sleep apnea, what else? B12 deficiency, maybe, vitamin D deficiency. What was the other one? Anemia, sleep apnea, thyroid, vitamin D, diabetes. Yeah, get your blood sugar checked. Thanks, chat. Lab tests for gamers. Yes, thank you, Tech Teller. Yep. Vitamin D more than B for us, chattars. Okay, let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap up, okay? All right. So comparison destroys personality. I'm not sharp enough. I'm not colorful enough, right? So this is a post that I've seen. I saw got posted. It basically is talking about comparison and how anytime, what we tend to do is we look at what other people have that we don't have, and we tend to think oh, I'm lacking in this way, instead of thinking about our strengths. So what's going on here? So first of all, I think this meme is pretty insightful. And so people will also say that comparison is the thief of joy, which I think is true. I also happen to think that comparison is the thief of success. So I think if you look at these two objects, right, like it's not just that the crayon isn't sharp enough. It's that if you try to do what this colored pencil or this pencil is doing, you're not actually like living up to your best potential, and you're shooting yourself in the foot in terms of success. Similarly for the pencil, if it looks at the crayon as like, oh, I'm not colorful enough, like that's not what a pencil is for. So I think that oftentimes not only is comparison like the thief of joy, it is also the function of the ahamkar, the ego. One of the major functions of the ego is to compare. It also like tends to make you less successful because you're trying to, you're trying to be something that you're not. And so you're going to actually be ignoring a lot of your good qualities. So let's talk for a second about like, where does this concept of like success come from, and why does our mind compare things in this way? So what I'm going to do is actually find another picture real quick. So what do you guys know about survival of the fittest? You guys know what that means? Does that mean that the strongest survives? Interesting, right? So that's what people think. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about Charles Darwin and how there's been a huge misunderstanding between like what Charles Darwin was saying and what it's come to mean. So Charles Darwin said that like it's survival of the fittest. And what people have started to interpret that as is like, the stronger, faster, smarter, healthier you are, the more likely you are to be successful. So what our society has managed to do is make the idea of fit and make it like universal. That this person, and we'll even say this, right? We'll say like, oh, like this person is fit. Like, what does that mean? That means like one particular thing. But what Darwin was actually saying is that which fits is actually the most likely to survive. And so survival of the fittest is not about an objective standard, which you should try to shoot for, like being healthier, more muscular, having a full set of hair, having money, like whatever. That's not actually what Darwin was saying, which is what all like the alpha red pill kind of people think. That's not actually what he was saying. What he was saying is that, so if you look at this beak, for example, this beak is stronger than this beak, right? Look at how strong and manly that beak is. But what Darwin sort of discovered is that there is no objectively correct beak. There is no like fitter beak. That the beaks that you have, what makes them fit is the environment that they're a part of. And so survival of the fittest is not about reaching an objective goal. It is about actually like molding to your current environment. And so if we kind of go back to this image, we see like a huge problem of why this leads to a lack of success. And so I'm sure some smartass in the comments, if they haven't done it already, maybe Twitch chat will say this. They'll say like, oh, what about being a colored pencil? What if I have the qualities of color and sharpness? Isn't that what I should aim for? And so this is the kind of thing where like, once again, it's this idea of like, there is an objectively right answer, which all people should aspire to. You guys want to see, should we check the comments? Oh, here we go. Look at this. Not only one, the top two comments. Right? Of course. So that's how our mind works. So our mind has this idea that there is a best way to be. And then people like Charles Darwin come along. They write The Origin of Species, and a bunch of noobs misinterpret it. And they think that, oh, I should be like this Sigma Chad, whatever. And so this is the kind of thing where like, that's actually the wrong thinking. The thinking of objective success and objective value is actually like incorrect. So let's understand this for a second. Where does this thinking come from? Right? Where do we get this idea that there is a best way to be? So this is what happens, literally. This is how our brain functions, okay? So we're going to understand some basic stuff about psychology. So the first thing to understand about the brain is a pattern-generating machine. All it does is put together patterns. So like, it will like, and it's amazing that it does this, right? This is how human beings discovered that like clouds lead to rain, because we observed lots of different stimuli and we sort of figured out, okay, like there are clouds and now it's raining. So we generate patterns out of stuff. This is also how we come up with stuff like Ayurveda and astrology and other kinds of things, like even terms like alpha and sigma and stuff like that. What is that? They're all pattern recognition, right? We're like looking at a million people and we're going to reduce them to two simple things, the alphas and the betas. And now someone's coming up with the sigmas and the thetas or whatever. I lose track of that stuff. But it is our mind essentially reducing things to pattern, which doesn't make them real. It just makes it easy to understand, right? If I start dividing the world into alphas and betas, successful people and losers, the haves and the have-nots, it makes it really easy to navigate the world because like, okay, like this person is a privileged person and I'm in a minority, easy. Or the other way around, that person's a minority and I'm a privileged person. This person is a Dota player, this person is a LoL player. And once we start deriving these patterns and labeling people, it's like easy. Like, oh, you play LoL, you're a noob. You play Dota, you're a noob. Like it makes things cognitively very easy. So the first thing to understand is that our mind is designed to generate patterns. It has evolved this way, and it's because of our pattern generation that we have things like microphones. Like this is a consequence of pattern generation in the mind, right? Because we like discovered all kinds of things because we look for patterns. Second thing, so where does this pattern of success come from, right? So we like create this idea of success. Where does that come from? So early on, chances are you had some kind of experience that was emotionally engaging or jarring, okay? So you had something where you saw someone who was more successful than you were. And then like that experience was so cognitively jarring or emotionally engaging that your mind started to create something that I'd call a cognitive filter. So if, for example, one time you were like in a math contest and you got beat by an Asian kid, then you will think like, oh my God, Asians are good at math, okay? And because it's an emotionally engaging experience, your mind is going to try to generate a pattern out of it. That's just like how it works. So the next thing that happens is once you have the cognitive filter, your mind has a heightened threshold for detection of a particular thing, like Asians are good at math. And then what happens is you go to your advanced math class, and sure enough, 30% of the kids are Asian. And so then your confirmation, now you have a filter and you found one piece of information that because of your cognitive filter gets reinforced. And then this idea that Asians are good at math gets like propagated, right? Now here's the interesting thing. Let's say you go visit China and then you're surrounded by Asian people, but your mind does not think, oh, look, there's just a normal variability of people who are good at math. It just so happens that the Asians in my school, because their parents were like into education and emphasize education, and they're the ones that were able to like immigrate to the US, you forget about all that. But like, let's forget for a minute that there's 1.3 billion or more than 1.3 billion. I'm just thinking about China. But like, there's like, 2 billion Asian people out there. Not all of them are good at math. But once we have the cognitive filter in place, we select for like some kind of information that reinforces our belief. So what kind of changes over time is we sort of create a we create a sort of cognitive filter that's based on an emotional experience, and then that cognitive filter gets reinforced selectively over time, and then we end up with a belief. For example, this is what success looks like. This is what I should be like. Okay? And then it seems like people are getting super, super caught up in the Asian stuff, but interesting tidbit. So by orientation, first day of orientation at the Harvard Medical School in Massachusetts General Hospital, literally like 50% of the room, like not even an exaggeration, 50% of the room was South Asian or East Asian. Like not an exaggeration at all. I was like, wow, there are a lot of brown people here. It's wild. So once we have our cognitive, why are we just counting? What's going on? Okay. Are y'all good at math now too? We're going to start doing 2 + 2? So once we have a cognitive filter in place, then we like start to like reinforce that filter. And this is where the idea of success comes from. So early on, we have this idea of like what success is. And then like it gets reinforced over time again and again and again. And as that idea gets reinforced, it'll sort of get shaped into this like Frankenstein's monster of like what a successful person looks like, right? They're tall, they're attractive, they're wealthy, they're good at math, they speak multiple languages, they're physically in shape, they, do things that are challenging for them, they know how to surf, they own a yacht, like there are all kinds of like different attributes that this person sort of has. And then what our mind does is anytime it thinks about us and it looks at another human being, it sees what attributes does that person have compared to the perfect person. And it does a series of selective comparisons. So when my mind looks at other people, if I am the crayon, when I look at the colored pencil, when I'm the crayon and I look at the pencil, I'm going to pay attention to its sharpness. I'm not going to pay attention to its color. When I'm a crayon that I compare myself to, let's say, an unsharpened pencil, what I'll compare myself to is the eraser. And I'll say, oh, wow, look at that. Like this pencil, even if it doesn't have a point, can't write anything. At least it can erase. Similarly, the pencil may look at the colored pencil, right? And may say like, oh, like, look, this pencil has more color than I do. Forget the fact that, like, let's be honest, like way more like drawings that have, just plain pencil seem to be a lot more popular, but the regular pencil isn't going to think about that when it's going to compare itself to the colored pencil. And then similarly, the pencil will compare itself to the Sharpie and will be like, oh my God, like the permanent marker is able to like be never erased. And look at how amazing that is. Whereas like, it's so easy for me to be erased. And then the Sharpie is looking at like, oh my God, like people who have households with children will never buy me because a child with a Sharpie is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Right? So it's like looking at, I wish like I could be used to make I wish I could be used by children. So it sort of doesn't matter what you are. Your mind will always compare you to people that are like better than you in one dimension. And when you go around comparing yourself to people, what you end up doing is comparing the one attribute that they have that you don't have. And so this is all a function of the ego. And so comparison absolutely will destroy, I don't know about personality, it's absolutely the thief of joy. And we have sort of this idea of like what a successful person is. You guys are still counting? And then you're going to end up like screwing yourself over. So we have since this is kind of, I'm a little bit distracted with the ADHD, but counting never stops. Okay. So if you guys want a more coherent, we do talk about comparison in the Ahamkar in Dr. K's guide. So if this was like a bit too, sorry, I got distracted. My point was that like, absolutely we compare for a reason. It starts with an emotionally engaging experience. And once we have that emotionally engaging experience, we have a cognitive filter. We sift information through that cognitive filter and we develop this idea of success, this generic idea of success. And then we strive to be that thing, and our mind notices all of the ways in which we are not that ideal perfection and tends to notice all of the ways in which other people are. And so our mind is playing a rigged game. And the real sad thing is that the rigged game that the mind is playing doesn't actually help you. And in fact, stepping away from that game is precisely how you become effective and successful. And it looks like we hit 100. Or we keep going? Or 101? Yeah, so actually this is great. So Tech Teller was saying chat is hyper-focusing. So notice what's happening, right? Like, how are y'all able to do this? This is actually really cool. It's a very neat experiment. This whole time, chat has been focused on one thing. You got inspired on something, and now you don't want to let it go, right? It's like a dog that's gotten something in its teeth. And so, like, just imagine that if you had this energy and you could cultivate it towards something useful, Not to say, I guess that implies this isn't useful. I think this has use. We can get something out of it, right? Which goes back to like, let's be who we are and let's make an illustrative point out of this, which is absolutely useful because now we can talk about, oh, look what we're capable of if we get inspired to do something, and we're with a community of people who's doing it. Someone was asking, what if I don't have discipline? And the answer that I gave was like, find inspiration and find other people. And this is a prime example. You guys have done a wonderful job of proving that point. You can take the most ADHD chat. You can give ADHD chat a lecture on ADHD. And what they will end up doing is counting to 135. And y'all have been doing that for like 20 minutes now, right? So you can absolutely do this. Just get inspired by the right thing. Notice what's happening within you right now. Right? Like you get excited and you're like, this is cool. I'm a part of something. We're doing something together. And so as you engage, like really pay attention. This is going to be our meditation for the day, I guess. I was going to do another Shunya meditation, but I don't think chat can handle that. So let's roll with the punches. So like notice, what is it about this that you're enjoying? Like what is the nature of this happiness? What is it that drives you to do this? Right? There's something very magical going on. And so people are saying, like companionship, community, absolutely. Being contrary, very good, right? So Dr. K is trying to teach. And we're like, no, Dr. K, we're going to we're going to count. And it's like, okay, so count. And now we're going. So trolling is magical. Yeah, so what about trolling is magical? Right? Looks like a Alinity raid. Are we getting raided by Alinity? I can't tell. Oh, Alinity is raiding with a party of 5,000. Okay. Welcome, Alinity fans. I hope Alinity is doing well. Y'all have entered at a very strange time. So Alinity just raided us with 5,000. I don't know how much longer we're going to be around because I'm about to wrap up too, but chat has managed to, we did a lecture on ADHD. I think it was good. It was like about, why ADHD exists in the world, like understanding the evolutionary perspective of ADHD. And somewhere along the way, people started counting. When did y'all start the counting? And now what chat is doing is, in spite of my best efforts, they are just counting to see how high they can go. And so I guess we'll just, at this point, I suppose maybe what I'll do is just start playing Dota. And then we'll just see if chat wants to just count for a while, like we can do that. Right? And let's see how high we can go. Because I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to engage with y'all more substantially, but I don't think I can. Like, what do y'all want me to do while y'all are counting? Okay, let's do the cringe post. Okay. So, let's talk about, we're going to do one more quick thing. All right, so embrace cringe. This is us fearing cringe. This is us being cringe, I suppose. So, like, what does this mean? Okay. We're all on the bus together. Let me try to, I'm a little bit, this is chat, so who can help me understand this? So here's what I'd say about this, okay? We are what we are. Right? So this goes back to the person who was like, am I lazy or do I have ADHD? We are what we are. That's what we are. You can't be anything but what you are. And so then the question is, are you satisfied with it? Right? So in Buddhism, there's this idea of the two arrows. And so in life, we get hit by two arrows. The first arrow is the one that life shoots at us, which is like a bad event, let's say, that is out of our control. And the second arrow is the one that we shoot at ourselves for being hit by the first one. And so we beat ourselves up for being the way that we are. So like you may have ADHD and that's like, it's not great, but that's what you have. And then there's all the shame that comes with, oh my God, I wish I didn't have ADHD. Life would be so much easier, which is maybe true, but you are what you are, right? And so even if we're all a little bit cringe, like we can just embrace it and then life becomes better. So, you know, if you are what you are, then just like embrace that, right? It doesn't mean that you can't change. And I think actually change starts with embracing who you are, because then you can move from towards something, right? But you got to start where you are. And so I'm not saying that, and this is like important kind of, because I'm not saying that embracing cringe is a license to be more cringe. We don't want to do that. But at the same time, like if you love Dungeons and Dragons, for example, just like love Dungeons and Dragons, like that's okay. It's, you know, like in terms of embracing cringe, I remember trying to explain to people at Mass General that I was like, yeah, like I started streaming on Twitch, and they're like, what is that? Right? Because these are people who are faculty at the Harvard Medical School. And I was like, yeah, that's just kind of like what I do. I just stream on Twitch. And they were like super confused. And it's not going to get me promoted, but you know, it is who I am. Okay, so it looks like we're up to 300. So what do y'all seriously, like, what are we doing? Are you ashamed of us? No, I'm not ashamed of you. That's why I told people that I work with, that I stream. The very opposite. Shunya meditation? Can we please meditate? Okay. Hold on a second. Let me think about this. We can absolutely do a Shunya meditation if you guys want to. But we're going to ask our rated people who are rating us, what do y'all want to do? Because y'all are new. Welcome, everyone. My name is Alok Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist. And here on stream, we talk about mental health. But we also will do teaching and stuff like that. So what do y'all want to see us do? So I'll give y'all a choice. We can meditate. We can continue counting. We can raid someone else and stop streaming. Or we can play some Dota while y'all are just counting. If y'all are just going to AFK count. And in terms of the meditation, maybe we can do a counting meditation. Or we can do a Shunya meditation. Oh my God. It seems like the meditators are winning, chat. Okay, we're going to meditate. Thank you very much, mods. Okay, let's meditate. So we're going to do Shunya meditation, okay? So everyone is wondering, so for those of you that do compare yourselves, like if you find yourself comparing a lot and finding yourself, you know, winding up short, we're going to do another Shunya meditation, okay? So Shunya is the Sanskrit word that represents zero, void, or nothingness. And a lot of our dissatisfaction or unhappiness with life comes from identification with the ego. So what does that mean? That means that I am what I am, but I think I'm particular things. So I may identify with being a medical doctor. And the interesting thing is that that's a part of my identity. It's not a part of me. So you can't like biopsy me and find a medical doctor anywhere. You can't, it's not like an actual part. If I get abducted by aliens and they dissect me, they won't find a medical doctor anywhere within me. Medical doctor is an aspect of my psychological identity, which I label onto myself. And that tends to be the source of our suffering. And so if we want to be free from comparison, for example, like if you find yourself comparing yourself to other people, that comparison requires an identity attribute, right? So I can't feel short unless someone else is tall, Or I can't think that someone else is tall unless I think I'm short. Everything is comparison. I guess technically you can say I'm taller, but you know. So most of our attributes, like I am successful, I am pretty, I am ugly, I am a failure, I am short, I am tall, I'm smart, I am stupid, I'm neurotypical, I'm neuroatypical. These are all attributes that we apply to ourselves. And so then the question becomes, how do I let go of comparison? And the way you let go of comparison one way is by doing shunya meditations. So shunya meditations will connect you to the void, nullness, or emptiness or nothingness within you. And that is actually like the most real part of you, which you'll discover if you do shunya meditation for a while. Is that, oh, this is actually the real me, and that what I am is like formless and doesn't actually have quality or attribute. So I think a good example of like people shortcutting to this experience are float tanks. So if you guys have done a float tank, what it aims to do is deprive you of all of these external stimuli. So all you're sort of left with is like sort of like nullness or voidness. Okay? How do I not dissociate while doing that? You may dissociate while doing that, which is sort of the point, right? So I'm not talking about a clinical dissociation. So if you have a history of trauma, you may not want to do this practice. If you have a history of depersonalization or dissociation, you may not want to do this practice. But the point is to sort of separate yourself from your identity, because like in that place, it's like really nice and comforting. Okay? So we're gonna try this. For those of you who want to count, by all means, continue counting. Okay? We're gonna close our eyes and do a practice. So I want everyone to sit up straight. Okay? Go ahead and close your eyes. Sit with your back straight, neck straight. So this is going to be a shunya body scan or body withdrawal technique. So over the course of this technique, what we're going to do is pick particular body parts and start at the furthest tip away from the core of our being. And we're going to notice the sensations at the furthest tip, and then start to notice the sensations closer and closer to the core of our being. And we'll wind up focusing on the center of ourselves, which will actually bizarrely be absent of sensation. And so we're going to find the nothingness in the core of ourself. So I want you to start by taking a deep breath in and slowly exhale. And then you can pick a particular body part, like an arm, a leg. So pick a limb or two limbs. If you have ADHD, you can even do all four limbs. And what I want you to do is, let's say I'm going to use my two arms, so I'm going to let my arms relax. I'm going to focus on the sensation at the tips of my fingers. So notice that the sensations are furthest from you, in a sense. And now I want you to move a little bit inward. So try to focus on kind of the middle of your fingers, not the tip, not the place where the fingers touch the palm of your hand, but your knuckles. Try to remain as still as possible. And now I want you to focus on the sensation where your finger touches your palm. So that joint, the knuckles. The outermost part of your palm. And now we're going to focus on the center of the palm. Just notice the sensations that you feel as you focus on the center of your palm. You are aware that your palm is there in space. And now we're going to move to the wrist. Notice the warmth in your wrists. And now we'll move to the forearms, the middle of the forearm. Notice how your hand is beyond it, and your elbow is before it. And now moving to the elbows. Notice how easy, how many sensations come from your elbows. The feeling of the joint, maybe the desire to move it. And you can go ahead and move it a little bit if you want to. Once again, to enhance the experience. So feel what it feels like to stretch out your arm. Relax your elbow. How much sensation it's filled with. And now move to the bicep. That too, you can move it a little bit if you want to. And now up to the shoulders. Feel the joint of your shoulder. Feel how, as you move it around a little bit, you can feel so many movements in other parts of your back, your scapula, for example, your back, your chest. And now move to the outer part of your chest. Take a deep breath in and notice that your chest expands. And as you exhale, notice that it relaxes. So feel the movement of your rib cages, your rib cage, your intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles are the parts that cause your ribs to expand and contract when you breathe. So you may notice them doing work that requires effort to breathe. And now I want you to move down into the core of your being and notice the sensations. And there may be a spot right in the middle, maybe above your stomach and below your solar plexus, halfway from your spine to your navel. There's going to be a space in the center of you. It's actually absent of sensation. You may feel hunger below it, breath above it. And just focus on that part. And notice how different it feels compared to the elbow or any other part of your body. Focus on the shunya within you. And feel the bliss of being without your identity. Even now as I speak, it's about to be shattered. But notice as it returns that in this moment, you in your life have challenges, have concerns. What about this? What about the holidays? What about grades, jobs, people? You have responsibilities, desires, shames, joys, prides. That all about your regular life, you bounce between these thoughts. I need to do this. I should do this. I'm proud of doing this. This person should do this. But as you do the shunya practice, notice how all of those things literally cease to exist. That in this moment, all of those thoughts, all of those cares, all of those goals, all of those desires are one and the same and completely absent. That which used to be such an important part of your life, you can step into a place where it no longer has any meaning. And now that I've mentioned them, maybe the mental activity is starting again. So now practice going from the mental activity back to shunya. Find that emptiness in the core of your being and return there with all of your focus. Your breath will help you with this. Breathe in and out. Use the breath as an anchor to go back into that place in the core of your being. And now go ahead and come back. I may have come back a bit too abruptly, but I was worried about the counters. Okay, so a lot of good comments. One person is saying, haven't found it again. That's okay. So I shattered it for you. But you can return there, do the body scanning practice. You'll get there again. Okay, no biggie. Okay, so I have this problem where I start to feel restless and furious. Absolutely. So well said. So as you do shunya practices, all of the suppressed crap in your identity will start to so do you guys get that shunya is void? It's a vacuum. So anything that is in there will get sucked into it. So as you embrace the shunya, crap will start to come up. So that's okay. You feel restless, feel furious, try to ride it out as best as you can, or even let it shatter you. So be it. Break the practice. And you can return to it again. And over time, you'll empty out that fury. Because it's not never ending, right? It's finite. It's just stored up energy. I was falling asleep, kinda lol. Yeah, so for the person who's not really falling asleep, you're entering into a different state of consciousness. You're at the doorway of a different state of consciousness, which is not wakefulness and is not sleep. But is sort of the best word you can use to describe it is kind of like sleep. So continue practicing, and then you'll be able to sit in that space for a long period of time. It'll also get more robust. People can come back just like that. And so the deeper you go into the practice and the harder it is to come back, the better you're doing it and the more you should continue to do it. Okay? So someone's saying it's not even nothingness because nothing is still something. It's beyond nothing. Yeah, so I think you're starting to get, that's why they came up with the word shunya, which also means vacuum or void, as opposed to nothing. Is there an empty space there physiologically? Excellent question. So the other way that you can do this practice is there are certain, so you have proprioceptive nerves. So those are the nerves that tell you where you are in space. So chances are that the shunya practices, there are 2 places in your body. So for those of you that are like riddle oriented and have inquisitive minds, so this can be meditation too. There are 2 places in your body where you can do shunya practices. 3 actually. So there are 3 places you can do shunya practices. Anyone have any idea of where you can do the shunya practices? So one is in the center of your being. The second one is in a place where, interestingly enough, you have no proprioception. And then the third place is very, very hard to find. And only an experienced meditator will find the third one. So your brain is correct. So you can do shunya practices in your brain because you have proprioception on the outside of your scalp. You have sensors and stuff through here, but right in the middle of your brain, you actually have no like tactile nerves, which is why you can do brain surgery on people while they're fully conscious. Like you can cut into brain and remove parts of the brain. They won't feel a thing. Okay, someone's asking, are you doing it wrong if the shunya isn't in the core of your body being, but overlaid on the entire body? No, you're not doing it wrong. So that's the thing. So when you meditate and you start to feel like nothingness outside of your body, like you're doing it right. Just keep following it. Just follow the practice. Follow the practice. Follow. Let it take you where it's going to take you. You'll discover the same thing, even if it's not what I guide you to find. Right? So I'm trying to guide people, but that guidance is going to be like off because I'm reducing things to words instead of like actual experiences. Cool, man, it feels so serene. Good. Felt kind of spacey and floaty. Fantastic, right? So then, like, here's the other interesting question. While y'all are doing this practice, who are you? Right? So if I were to ask you, like, tell me about yourself, you would say all kinds of things. But while you're doing this practice, are you any of those things? What happens to the truth of who you are? Right? And so, like, it's wild, man. Like, we spend our whole lives getting so caught up in all this crap. Like, I want this, and I'm not this, and this person is this, and I wish I had this. What is all that stuff? It's all like constructions of the mind. It's all abstractions. And like we get so caught up in it. And then people wonder, like you're like, oh, I really want to play video games today. I don't feel like working. Well, like, what is that feeling? If you do a shunya practice when you're unmotivated, it'll like, there will be no difference between 2 things. Playing a video game becomes the same as studying if you are centered in shunya. Because both of them are the same. It's all nothing. So why would you prefer one over the other? And then you can direct your mind more easily. Right? So the labels have a purpose in the world. But at the core of your experience, like that's not what it is. What's the third place? You try to find it. You have to meditate for a long, long time, usually. You'll find the third place. The third place is, interestingly enough, how can I describe it? It is a place within your body with no location. But it's a thing. It's hard to describe. It's something within you that actually doesn't have a physiologic correlate. But it's wild. This is why meditation is cool. Like once you like meditate for a while, like you'll discover like things that doesn't have a physiologic correlate. Actually, it does have a physiologic correlate. I take that back. Just practice, chat. Just practice. Keep doing it. You'll find it. All right. So, what do we, so who are we rating, chat? Clues? No clues. So for all of you, so notice for everyone who's wanting a clue and wants an answer, what y'all need to do is recognize that you have an intellectual curiosity. So even if I were to give you the answer, it's not going to help you at all. It's like you have an intellectual curiosity. Find it. Lindy just raided us, dude. Okay, she's not on. Who are we? Should we raid Pokemon? Hassan? Okay, we can raid Hassan. All right, let's raid Hassan. Okay, we'll see y'all on Wednesday. We'll try to get through a couple more posts. Sorry, I'm kind of tired today, so if the energy was a little bit low, I apologize. But we'll see you guys. We'll see y'all on Wednesday, okay? Take care.